I don't just talk about other people's stuff, I also make my own. Books in particular. To date, I have 4 books you can check out on Amazon. Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and the short story collection Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Hop on down to the description for Amazon links to all 4 books. Enjoy whichever ones you read, and enjoy the video.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Omni at the Movies, or Omni at the streaming channel, Omni at the DVD, whatever you choose to call it. I'm yet again doing an unscripted review of a new release, this time of another Small Town Monsters documentary. Their last new release, well, their old release now, Skinwalker Howl of the Rougarou, I reviewed upon its release. And so I'll be doing the same with their latest release, American Werewolves, which is sort of a spiritual successor, but otherwise unconnected and its own thing. Now, I have really enjoyed pretty much everything Small Town Monsters has done. As far as I'm concerned, Small Town Monsters is making the best paranormal documentaries currently. I know they're not the only ones. I know that Ancient Aliens is somehow still running. Travel Channel's pretty much fueled entirely by sensationalized paranormal stuff. But Small Town Monsters, I like the way they take the approach, where it's about archiving the stories, letting the audience decide for themselves, and just getting the information out there and doing some creative stuff along with it, because you gotta recreate what the eyewitnesses say they're seeing. But it all comes together to make an interesting bit of documentary entertainment, basically. It's a documentary, it's legitimate. They are archiving history, whether or not you believe it literally happened as described, but they're also making it visually interesting, they're making it appealing, and I just really appreciate the way they do that. American Werewolves is certainly continuing in that tradition, but it does things just a little bit differently in that it relies the most heavily on eyewitness testimonies. Other documentaries they've done, they've brought in the experts, they've gotten the scientific perspective, they've gotten the perspective from believers and skeptics and eyewitnesses. Here, though, they do have a couple of experts come in, but they play a very minimal role in the proceedings. This is predominantly about listening to the eyewitnesses and what they are seeing. And I'm sure you can tell by the title, what they are seeing is something that only seems like it's new to the cryptozoological realm. Dogmen. Called werewolves in the title, yes, and sometimes still referred to as that, but the more scientifically friendly term, if you will, is dogmen, because when we think werewolf, we think a human that can transform into a wolf. And we don't necessarily know that that's the case, but we're seeing things that look like anthropomorphic canines being reported, so dogman just seems like a more neutral term. And the documentary is about hearing what the eyewitnesses have to say about their encounters. Now, one thing Small Town Monsters always does is that each of their films is just a little bit different in terms of presentation, especially since they graduated from very low budget to suddenly having a budget and having more of an ability to do interesting things visually. That, like their first 3 films, they kept things fairly simple with still images and whatnot, but starting with the Mothman documentary, they could actually be a bit more creative with how they presented stuff. And each documentary has had a slightly different genre homage of sorts worked into the recreations. They're all still documentaries, but when it comes to presenting what the eyewitnesses saw, they go for different cinematic styles. Flatwoods Monster has a bit of 1950s alien invasion sprinkled into it. Momo the Missouri Monster is like 1/2 70s squatchploitation movie. The Mark of the Bell Witch is a full-on atmospheric ghost story, things like that. With American Werewolves, they kind of lean into the direction of analog horror. Analog horror, of course, being a fairly new subgenre that originated on the internet, built around the idea of things that were recorded on VHS or on tape recorders and whatnot, on analog formats basically, hence the name, of something. Either it was from a dashboard or it was a late night TV airing that was a sort of a weird broadcast or an interruption of a broadcast or something about it that just doesn't really work in terms of normalcy. And the horror comes from what is presented. Now, it's a purely stylistic choice to go more like an analog VHS presentation. They open with this weird little glitchy thing as if this were some sort of broadcast recorded on tape back in the late 80s or early 90s or something. And from there, whenever they get to the recreations that show the actual Dogman, which, much like in Howl of the Rougarou, is presented as a man in a suit again, and it's the same suit, I believe. But every time they go to that, the format, once again, has this weird cinematography to it, and there's artifacting and that weird static stuff that occurred on the top and bottom of the screens that used to be a problem with VHS tapes. Some of you don't even know. But it maintains that for the recreations. The documentary portions where they're actually interviewing the people look more normal, of course. But the whole thing, interestingly enough, is presented in 4:3 ratio, otherwise known as full frame. So that's where the black bars are on the left and right as opposed to the top and bottom. So that again adds to the overall feel, and it's that way the whole way through, not just in the recreation portions. So they really committed to it. Is it a format that works overall? I mean, it's not full-blown analog horror. It's not glitching out. There are no jump scares. There are no weird sort of fourth wall cannot protect you sort of things happening. But overall, it is effective, and it helps separate it from Howl of the Rougarou, which went for a more generalized found footage format when doing its recreations. So overall, that part works. As far as the music, which underscores everything, it's basically a Stranger Things score. Like, I don't necessarily want to say derivative per se, but when I first heard the music start up, as I popped it in the player and let it go, my immediate thought was, oh, sounds like the Stranger Things opening, where it's sort of that dark ambient 80s synth wave sort of music. And it's not bad, mind you, but it is there's no possible way to compare it to anything other than Stranger Things. I've heard the other soundtracks they've used in their past movies. I even have 2 of them on CD because they were available through the website. And they had a more original sound than the American Werewolves soundtrack. But the soundtrack was deliberately done as part of the overall aesthetic of the films, so make of that what you will. As far as what is actually presented, like I said, it leans heavily on eyewitness testimonies. Just having the eyewitnesses sit down and say what they experienced. And what they say is surprisingly compelling. I want to be upfront in saying that I don't think any of them are lying. Even though they don't have any physical proof to back up their claims, I don't believe that they are making any of it up. What they are saying was their genuine experience. Now, whether or not that means they encountered literal werewolves or some new form of canine or a prankster or something else entirely, who can really say? Like I said, there's no photos, there's no videos. A lot of these encounters happened in an age before people would have had cameras readily on them at all times. So we don't have anything to physically show an example, but like, I don't think they're making it up, and I don't think they're just performing for the camera. If they are performing, then they all need to be cast as the leads in some kind of movie because they would be the best performers ever. I've seen enough mockumentaries to know the difference. You can tell when someone's in a mockumentary, which is like documentary style story, but it's knowingly fiction, you can tell that they are performing. There's something about the way they hold themselves, the way they talk, the look in their eyes, even the nature in which they recite stuff, which doesn't necessarily mean it's bad acting, mind you, but you can tell it's not just a real person talking about their real experiences. You can tell it is a performance. Again, that's not to say a bad performance. I mean, you can tell when someone playing a superhero is giving a performance and not acting like a real person. That doesn't mean that person's acting poorly either. So it overall makes it very interesting to listen to, and I realize that probably won't agree with everyone. I saw a couple of reviews on IMDb of the movie. I just decided to look them up. And I saw some people saying, oh, it's nothing but campfire stories and urban legends. They don't actually present any evidence. And I'm kind of like looking at that and thinking, okay, I can understand why you might be disappointed that they didn't like suddenly reveal a shocking photo of a dogman that had never been shown before. But if that's your main complaint, you're kind of missing the point. Small Town Monsters' whole thing was that they set out to archive the stories and get them out there to the world. The important thing is that these stories survive. Whether or not they are true, it's not their place to cast judgment on that. They are simply getting the stories out there. And sure, they're going to present it as literal monsters and aliens when they do the recreations, but they're not trying to actually sway you one way or the other. They're just letting the eyewitnesses speak for themselves. You can decide for yourself whether or not you believe them. But the important thing is that these stories are being told and made available. So even if it is all just campfire stories in the end, they're really compelling campfire stories. Though personally, I don't think that's the case. I think that these are true accounts, though, again, who's to say what these things literally are? The Dogman I mentioned at the beginning is seen as kind of a newcomer to cryptozoology, but that's simply because, again, we didn't really have a term for it before. We thought werewolf, the first real sighting of a Dogman, which Small Town Monsters also covered, was the Beast of Bray Road. That was the first time that this kind of creature was actually reported, and it actually caught fire and people started really looking into it. And even then, it wasn't referred to as a dogman, it was referred to as a werewolf, almost tongue-in-cheek at first. So it had that stigma, and one of the guys in American Werewolves even says that he kind of thinks because of that stigma, a lot of sightings for the Dogman, which may have occurred long, long before, might have just gotten lumped together with Bigfoot sightings. Who knows? Ultimately, though, what I really appreciate about this documentary is that it inspired me. Because these stories, whether they are literal encounters with monsters or misunderstandings or what, they are compelling stories, and they really got the gears turning. One bit of advice I would give to people who are looking into writing, becoming writers, and especially if they're looking at becoming writers of weird fiction, let's say, sci-fi, horror, fantasy, the genre fictions, basically, my advice is you gotta read stuff about paranormal research. Whether you believe it or not, you should read it because you might find inspiration for some great stories in there. And I found inspiration for a potentially good story in American Werewolves. I don't necessarily want to give anything away, but the last account we listened to, the last guy who gives his eyewitness testimony of what he experienced, again, whether or not it really is a literal monster encounter, it wasn't just of a dogman. There were other creatures there too. And in a national park where it's possible things have been covered up, That's all I'm going to say. I don't want to give anything away to you, but I heard that story and I was thinking, I want to believe him, first of all, but also, this could be a novel. This could be a movie. This could be something really neat. It's too good of a concept not to have something done with it. And I'm going to try doing something with it. And I might not have tried at all had it not been for seeing this movie and having this story, which may have otherwise just faded away, be put out there for any and everyone to hear and make up their own minds about. So if there's any reason I can recommend American Werewolves and all the Small Town Monsters documentaries, it's that. Storytelling is about passing things on and carrying legacies in a lot of ways, and that makes these things worth watching, including the most recent example. Again, it's different from what came before. It's far more leaning on to the idea of eyewitness testimony, as said, but you can't help but listen. So listen. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off.
Congratulations, you reached the end. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to consider supporting us on Patreon. Of course, the other way to support us is to go to Amazon and check out our books: Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, The Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Also check the description for links to DeviantArt and other platforms we operate. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.